Under snapping options, you can bring down the snap drop down, and from here under grid type we could change from infinite to static. Static is a new type of grid, and I'll begin going over what can be expected with this particular type of grid. So same controls to bring it up. We hold control and we're able to bring up the grid. Since I'm using nearest edge, we're actually orienting it to the nearest edge, similar to before. Some of the new things you can actually do with this grid is while I'm holding control, I can control and right click in order to extend the grid, which is one of my favorite things to do. Also love holding down control and shift in order to freely extend the grid however I'd like. Once the border turns black, that means that the grid is in a locked state, meaning that no matter how I rotate the view, the grid will remain where it is positioned. If I hold down control and I roll the wheel, you see I'm able to of course make things scale up and scale down, but if I hold shift and roll the wheel, you can see I'm able to add additional subdivisions. The key thing with this particular grid in comparison to our previous attempt is that we're able to support many more cells on the grid than we were before. An important thing to also note with this grid is if we press Shift V and we change over to face fit, whenever we press control over the surface, we'll see it attempt to fit the grid to the particular face that's located under the mouse. So in this case, it actually didn't show up as I would expect. However, it does give you a nice starting point for you to be able to just draw out your grid, subdivide it, and just get in and get to work. In fact, you could press tab in order to unlock the grid and be able to freely move it around, or you could even press spacebar to lock and unlock the grid just on the fly. Another interesting thing about this grid is you can press R in order to rotate. You could hold down control during rotate in order to do fine rotation or moving it on certain degree increments. You could press R and X, Y, and Z to rotate it as you would normally expect. In addition to that, you can also press S in order to scale the grid. Having your mouse cursor on the border whenever you press S allows you to scale it evenly. However, if you have the mouse somewhere on the inside and you press S, you'll see that the grid will scale abnormally. So usually I have my mouse position on the edges, press S, and then I'm able to scale it very gracefully. But the most important thing to remember is that anytime you want to extend it, you can just press E and jump into an extension mode, click to place it. You can press E, hold control and shift and freely extend it, click and just place it. And of course, most importantly, anytime you want to get rid of the grid, just press escape to remove the grid. So really it's that easy when it comes to getting started with the grid. In fact, I can just go select my area that I want to get started with, draw my grid, subdivide it into place. From here I begin drawing. We can see that the moment I begin working, the grid begins lowering its opacity, so that way I can focus on the mesh, which is the most important part of this matter, not so much the grid. However, if you like, you can also turn off auto opacity on the fly. So that's where some of these options come in. So the first one I want to talk about is dot preview. In fact, we'll just turn everything else off until it becomes relevant. Dot preview means that static has a level of interactivity with dot. So by having this on, if we turn off grid, we can see that there's now a red square showing whenever you hover over dots. The cool thing about this is if you roll the wheel, it will just turn that dot into a grid. So for example, I'll come over to this area, hover over the dot, just looking at the various alignment solutions that are being offered. I can press Shift V, we'll change this back to nearest edge, and really grab this area that we want, roll the wheel, and now we have a grid actually spawning from that particular point in space. We could be subdividing it. We could press RX in order to rotate it on the X to get it positioned exactly how we want. Continuing subdividing it, press D to go through our pie menu, even canceling it. Should be able to keep this grid up on screen active. In fact, we've tried everything in our power to make this grid as static as possible. Even though this grid's a little off as far as for the shape I'm attempting to create, we'll be able to pull it off. And now we jump to the extrusion process. We'll just press T to give it a little thickness, bring it up, and that is basically dot preview. So sometimes you may want to have your grid off and then just hold control in order to read over the surface, see what your solutions are going to be. And then once you have the alignment point that you want, you can just roll in order to jump into the grid where it will start in an automatically pause state, which is an ideal state for using dots as a jump off for grid. So it's definitely a bigger and different expansion than what we'd normally be doing with our infinite line, but static offers something a little bit different when it comes to how dots and grid coalesce. So the next one I'm going to talk about is toggle grid overlay. So for this one, basically if we look at this from side view, we see that there's a grid up on screen, And if we actually turn on our grid, we can see that with this toggle on, that the view grid for Blender actually disappears, allowing you to get a better grid result. This option was added because there were some occasions where if you have your grid up in addition to Blender's grid at the same time and you begin subdividing points, you might notice that there's just a little bit of difference between our grid and Blender's grid, and you can actually get it to be exactly the same way by getting it on the right numerical amount. However, it's just sometimes easier to focus on a model at hand and actually get rid of the grid in order to ensure that you're able to draw it the way that you want to, instead of trying to orient it exactly with Blender's grid in the background. So for that reason, toggle grid overlay is on, just in case you want to toggle the particular grid that's in the background off. As you can see, in addition to this static grid supports surface, view, and world, just like you would expect with any of our grids. The next one I want to talk about is always in front. So if we were to look over the surface and we set our grid down, we see that this grid is actually showing no matter what. We can't see any sort of obscuring happening with this grid because of it penetrating with the surface, and that is because always in front is on. If you turn always in front off, we can see that the grid is, while it's locked, we are able to see it show up in some places but not in other places, and this is where the snapping difference with the surface is beginning to exist. So it's just letting you know that this is happening, and for that reason we have an option with static grid to either show it in front like you're seeing here, or have the grid actually disappear whenever it's being obscured by a mesh. So this can actually come in handy whenever you're, say, working on the surface and you're trying to do something and tell exactly how far into the surface that you're penetrating. It also became brought to my attention that we possibly need to come up with a layering system so that way we can have a semi-transparent mesh whenever it's intersecting with the mesh, but for now we do have the option to at least have the grid obscured whenever it has a penetration with the solid mesh. The next one I want to talk about is auto transparency, which basically we have our grid up. If we were to tab it, in fact, let's actually place it on the top level and hold Control Shift, roll this out, Shift roll a few segments in, and we're already inside of Ngon, and we'll just begin drawing. And notice that the moment I begin drawing, the grid goes into a semi-transparent state. And this is something that was done intentionally to ensure that even if you're using the grid in edit mode, you're able to still recognize the mesh underneath and what's going on, instead of having it be obscured by the grid, which was something we were trying to avoid with our infinite grid to begin with. However, for this, I'll turn transparency off, and let's actually orient the grid to this nearest edge. And we'll just lock that in and Control Shift drag to extend it out. And we'll just draw a shape here. And just like that, we can see the grid failing to actually go into an auto transparent mode during drawing. So the grid is set up for users to be able to set up to however they like, but all these toggles are there in order for you to customize this to your best experience. There's a lot of interesting things with this grid that have yet to be expanded on, and for now will probably seem like a mystery until we expand on it further in the future. One of those is that you can literally draw a grid mesh. You can add your subdivisions however you want, and you can press Shift G and it will just drop it as a mesh. This is something that was added because I asked for it. However, in the future it'll definitely become a lot more handy, but for now just know that it's the precursor to us being able to drop the grid as a mesh, and hopefully later be able to recall, reuse, and recall grid positions. I talked about previously how there were some differences with the way dots behave inside of static versus infinite. One of those is that you can tap Control and the dots will just stay on screen. However, they'll no longer begin searching under your active cursor. I believe this has been done in order to increase stability and have it crash less. However, we could see that we could just tap Control, the dots will remain on screen. We're able to zoom in and out because as of now, Boxcutter now has 3D dots. Previously, there were 2D dots, which were deemed incompatible with our 3D grid. And we're able to just hover over each dot, seeing what potential alignment point we're being given before we even begin drawing. And if we want to expand this into something more staticky, like static grid, we could just hold Control, roll the wheel, roll this grid into place, playing off of the angle that we chose, just extend the grid out however we'd like. like shift, roll the wheel in order to bring it out, and here we are able to rock and roll with our grid. So the holding control in order to statically keep the dots is something that I found to be a little bit interesting of a curiosity. However, another example I want to show is that if we press control in and make a new file, I'll just delete this cube, press control spacebar to control shift spacebar to go full screen, and we'll just shift A at our plane, alt V wireframe, and we just want to switch over to box, shift X. And I just want to show another interesting thing about static grid at this time, and that is the face fill capabilities that it has at this time. This was something that we had a little bit stronger in the development process. However, near the end, it became a bit tricky to get integrated with certain systems, so we had to dial it back a little bit. So if I press shift V, we can change this over to face fit, and if we turn on grid and we hold control over the grid, we see that the grid is actually catered to fit the face that it was tracing over. However, of course, it's always going to try to place the grid in an area similar to where you started off. So right here we see that the central point is here. It's not going to fit the grid to fit over this face in object mode. However, if we go and hover over some of these individual faces and just hold control and roll our grid, we see that we're able to get a really interesting orientation system happening here when it comes to the initial positioning of our grid. And this is just one of those things that even right here, I kind of ponder why it's being obscured. However, it could be because we're using a two-dimensional planar object. So in these cases, you probably want to have auto transparency toggled off. However, I am still wondering why the grid is showing beneath the mesh here, but on top of the mesh here. So this is definitely a curiosity, but isn't a game changer. Except we really do need the grid to show up where it's supposed to. You know, how are we supposed to work with it when it's stuck on the other side? Let's press Alt V, look at face orientation, and we see the culprit of what happened. So this isn't even so much an issue that I need to report back to the team to drive them further insane. It's us needing to get in and actually troubleshoot the situation and see what's happening with our face orientation. So there's a degree of offset that happens with the grid and the surface in order to make sure that it's sitting on top of the surface. However, if your face is flipped, it's going to actually do the opposite of that. So just a little bit of troubleshooting on the fly there, but now we see that we are in business and every face is behaving as you would expect. And so this could come in handy for cases where you want to work a particular face or just start your grid off there and begin subdividing and begin drawing your shapes oriented to the shape happening on the inside, as you see me doing here, just using knife box. But with that, I just want to show a few additional curiosities with the new static grid and the way it behaves with dots, just to give you a heads up that you may be experiencing some differences whenever you use the static grid compared to its general behaviors expected with infinite. So here I have snapping and grid enabled, and I'm currently set to infinite. If we set up infinite, we see that this is the smallest that this is able to go. If I roll the wheel, I'm able to basically adjust it to the size that's needed. In fact, I can roll this grid as far out as needed without any limit, and that is basically the foundation of the name Gridfinite. However, whenever it comes to adding additional points to it, that's where things get a little sticky with this particular iteration of grid. So if we were to go under the grid settings and set this to something like 50, and we bring up the grid, we see that performance begins choking to a standstill. And this is something that I'm able to show today because we'll definitely be solving it tomorrow. But for now, just notice how whenever you bring up a grid like this, it just begins choking, and not even the dot's able to keep up with my cursor at this point. And you know, really it's not needed for us to have the grid at so high a unit count. You know, even something like 10 will definitely just do the job. And you really don't need to see so many points at the same time whenever you're working. However, there is a contingency of users who do feel the need to see so many points at the same time, and AR just happens to be one of them. So if we just bring out our grid and control right click to bring this out, we are able to basically scroll an impossibly high amount of points into this grid and roll our view around and everything and just continue maneuvering without any sort of difficulty. And if we zoom in, we can see that we have the finest lattice of grid points ever. I mean, really, it's ridiculous to even work at such a fine amount of grid points, but I'm happy to see that it's able to perform so quickly and so nimbly without issue, even though normally with the other grid, this would normally just be the end of it and Blender would just be turning white and the session would end. And best of all, I can of course just press escape to get rid of it. But at any time I want to, I can just align to an edge because I'm under Shift V nearest edge, bring my grid in, you know, maybe even Shift right click, Control right click to drag it out, and just roll in just an impossible amount and zoom in on it, hold Shift and roll to adjust how many I need exactly. But this is one of the main differences between the two grids, is because of the technology at their foundation, that this one's just inherently fast. This one's just going to be a faster solution at this time, but we will be coming back to deal with Infinite in this respect. So previously I don't believe I talked about S, or as far as S and its capacity and its usage with the static grid. So here I am pressing Control in order to snap it to the nearest edge, and I'll just hold Control and Shift in order to free extend. And then from here I can press S in order to scale it out. I can also hold Shift at this point and begin to break the rules of what a grid is to me. This was something I talked about a lot internally. I was like, we shouldn't be able to do this. However, we see that it actually made it to the finish line, where basically if you want your grid to be a set of units that are unequal to equidistant square units, you can do that by just holding Shift during the scale operation and then just clicking, and you're still able to of course hold Shift and roll in additional subdivisions, but you'll see that the proportions are different than what you're normally used to. And so I can always just escape to remove the grid and just draw in another grid in order to do it again. However, at any time you could just press S in order to scale, hold Shift and freely scale it in order to get a particular type of grid that normally I wouldn't go for. Like for example, here I have some very rectangular units. I'll press Tab and lock it. However, I let go of the keys in the wrong order. So if I press S again, I will hold Shift, and before releasing Shift, I will click in order to end that operation, and then I can release Shift. And then from here I can press Shift and roll to begin adding additional segments. So in the event that I was trying to just really break the rules of what grid is, I can do it as you see here. However, it also seems to be affecting the bevel in this particular case. So definitely use scaling your grid with caution, but just letting you know that it is something that is supported by grid, even though I personally don't endorse it.